I never imagined my wedding would start with broken glass. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom, silencing laughter, freezing smiles. My mother-in-law stood there, her hand trembling, champagne dripping from her fingers. "You gold-digging fraud!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Guests stared at me, waiting for tears or rage, but I only smiled because 3 months ago I prepared for this exact moment. Every insult, every whisper, every lie, they were all recorded. And tucked inside my clutch was a document that would turn this entire wedding upside down. The music swelled as I stepped into the grand ballroom, my dress trailing like a river of ivory. The chandeliers threw warm light over polished marble, and every eye turned to me with admiration. 1,000 smiles greeted me, but behind them, I felt the weight of something sharper than curiosity: scrutiny. My heels clicked softly against the floor, the sound somehow louder in my head than the orchestra's melody. Daniel stood waiting at the altar, handsome as ever, his expression unreadable. He smiled, but there was a stiffness to it, as though it had been rehearsed. Applause erupted, and someone whispered, "She's lucky." I smiled in return, but the words slid over me like cold glass. I'd learned long ago that luck was just a mask people used when they didn't want to talk about preparation. The vows were said, rings exchanged, and applause rang again, louder this time. It was all perfect. Too perfect. The kind of perfection that comes with carefully staged performances. And I knew this entire wedding had been orchestrated to the last detail. Then came the gift. My mother-in-law, Victoria Reynolds, glided forward with the poise of someone who had spent her entire life in control. She held out a small velvet box. "A family treasure," she said, voice sweet enough to draw smiles from the guests. She opened the box to reveal an antique diamond ring, its silver band worn smooth by generations of Reynolds brides. Her eyes locked on mine as she slid it onto my finger. "If you ever bring shame to this family," she murmured just low enough for only me to hear, "I will take it back, and everything else." A polite laugh rippled from the guests, thinking she had made a charming joke. But the metal felt cold against my skin, heavier than it should. And then the first omen. The ring didn't fit. It snagged on my knuckle and sat awkwardly, refusing to settle as though it already knew it didn't belong there. I smiled anyway, because that's what was expected. We moved to the reception, champagne glasses raised in toasts. Laughter echoed, clinking glass punctuated every congratulation. But I noticed something. A camera pointed at me, lingering far too long. Not the official wedding photographer, a guest, or so it seemed, filming in a way that was too deliberate, too intentional. I recognized him. His name was Paul. He had no reason to be here other than the fact that he worked for Victoria. She didn't trust me, not even today, and she wanted every moment captured. I lifted my glass toward him in a mock toast, pretending not to notice how his lens tracked my every movement. While I smiled for the crowd, my mind worked in a different rhythm. I'd been in cybersecurity for nearly a decade before this. 3 months ago, I'd already infiltrated the Reynolds family's private communication channels. I'd listened to the planning, the meetings where they referred to me as the test Daniel needed to pass. Today wasn't just a wedding. It was an examination. An examination I was never supposed to survive. Victoria's plan was elegant in its cruelty. Make the day beautiful, make the bride feel welcomed, then wait for the perfect moment to expose a flaw. She believed that pressure could crack even the most carefully composed facade. She wasn't wrong, except she had chosen the wrong person to test. As the toasts ended, I excused myself to the bridal suite. The noise faded as I closed the heavy door behind me. I sat before the vanity, the antique mirror reflecting a composed bride. But I didn't see a bride. I saw a strategist, calm before execution. I reached for my laptop, hidden under silk scarves and makeup compacts. The screen came alive with a soft hum. A network map appeared instantly, dots of data flowing across like a constellation. Every microphone, every security feed in this house. I'd already marked them weeks ago. On the desktop sat a single file folder, Phase 1. I opened it briefly, scanning through my notes, guest lists, conversation transcripts, backup copies of recorded calls between Victoria and Melissa. Every insult, every whispered suspicion. Then, at the bottom of the window, I typed in today's date and added a final note. Phase 1. Completed. I closed the laptop, smoothed my dress, and looked in the mirror one last time. The ring on my finger gleamed under the warm light, still sitting awkwardly, still too tight. A smile touched my lips, calm, measured, almost tender. Out in the ballroom, the next act of this performance was waiting, and I was ready for my cue. The reception resumed with renewed warmth, or at least the performance of it. I returned to my seat beside Daniel, my expression the perfect blend of awe and shyness, a new bride basking in the glow of acceptance. Inside, I counted every step of the next move. The officiant called us forward for the candle lighting ceremony, a simple symbolic gesture of unity. I fumbled slightly with the match, letting it drop to the floor with a soft clink. A polite laugh passed through the room. "Nerves," someone said. Victoria's voice carried over them all, smooth but sharp. "It's a simple candle, dear," she said, her smile perfectly measured for the crowd, "but perhaps we can't expect perfection from everyone." The remark drew a few chuckles. My cheeks warmed, not from embarrassment, but from the quiet thrill of letting her think she had landed a blow. I bent to pick up the match, eyes flicking briefly to the far table. There, a woman in a pale lavender dress caught my gaze. She was introduced earlier as Aunt Margaret, a distant cousin from Daniel's father's side. But she was no relative. Her name was Evelyn Grant, my legal counsel, and the envelope resting discreetly in her clutch held the documents that would seal every marital asset beyond Victoria's reach. I gave the smallest nod, and Evelyn shifted slightly, her hand brushing the envelope as if it were nothing more than a napkin. A moment later, my phone vibrated in the hidden pocket of my dress. One message, contract filed, assets locked. The orchestra swelled, covering the sound of the notification. Across the table, Daniel's phone buzzed too. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing as he read the alert from his bank. His expression shifted. Confusion first, then something darker. I sipped my champagne, eyes meeting his over the rim of the glass. His smile stayed fixed for the crowd, but his knuckles whitened around the stem of his glass. It was time for the next layer. The dinner service began, silver trays carried by servers gliding through the aisles. Amid the clinking of cutlery and hum of conversation, I caught sight of Paul again, the cameraman in disguise. He had moved closer to the small stage, his camera angling toward the main television at the far end of the ballroom. That television had been broken for weeks, its screen flickering in faint static. Victoria had insisted it was too much trouble to replace before the wedding. She didn't know I had quietly ensured it stayed that way. As dessert was served, the screen suddenly came to life. At first, just more static. Then a faint image, a figure leaning toward another at a garden table. The audio cut in, clearer than anyone expected. "She's nothing but a polished parasite," Victoria's voice said, crisp and unmistakable. "A guest in this family until she proves her worth, which she won't." The room froze. Forks paused mid-air, eyes darting between the television and Victoria. Her smile faltered just for a second, the smallest crack in her carefully constructed mask. Paul turned off his camera, pretending to check the lens. The screen flickered back to static. Guests murmured, half convinced it was a technical glitch. But a few sharp eyes caught the truth. It had been too clean, too well-timed to be an accident. I didn't look at the screen. I focused instead on the tiny detail I wanted Victoria to notice. I hadn't even reacted. The band resumed playing, the tension in the air thin as glass. Victoria recovered quickly, raising her glass for another toast, her voice just a touch tighter. I excused myself from the table, stepping up to the stage as if it were part of the program. The microphone felt cool in my hand. Daniel watched me, uncertain, his earlier confusion still shadowing his eyes. "I'd like to say a few words," I began. The crowd quieted. This was the part where brides thanked their guests, expressed gratitude, shared sentimental stories. I let the pause hang just a beat too long. Instead, I smiled. Not the nervous smile of a bride, but the calm smile of someone holding a checkmate. "I have a few numbers I'd like to share," I said softly, my voice carrying across the room. Victoria's glass paused halfway to her lips, and just like that, the real wedding began. The moment I said, "I have a few numbers I'd like to share," the entire room shifted. I could feel it in the stillness, in the way champagne flutes froze halfway to lips and conversations ceased mid-sentence. I had them, every guest, every camera, every eye, but I also felt the tightening, the unseen noose pulling closer. Because what no one else knew was that the game had been rigged long before I arrived. 2 months before this wedding, I sat across from Daniel in our shared loft, and he asked me if I trusted him. I'd smiled and said yes. But that night, I'd opened a message on his laptop, an email from his mother labeled "Contingency Plan." The message didn't hide its intentions. If she's not Reynolds material, we make her walk, quietly or not. I'd read it twice, 3 times. Then I opened the attachments, bullet points, map timelines, and one line that stung like acid. "She has no real connections. Use that." But the part that stopped me cold was a note signed G. Grace. Grace. My former foster mother. The woman who'd taken me in at 15, nurtured me, then emptied my savings account when I turned 18. The same woman who vanished the day after I won my first tech grant. She was back, and she wasn't just watching. She was helping them plan. I thought I was the one orchestrating a long con, but they'd built a con of their own, one that used everything I once survived to tear me down now. Back in the ballroom, I felt it. The pull of the rug beneath my feet, slowly being yanked. Just as I was about to speak again, the ballroom doors burst open. Cameras flashed. Voices called out, "Emily Carter, is it true you falsified your academic credentials? Did you threaten the Reynolds family into marriage? Are you pregnant with another man's child?" A storm of reporters swarmed the floor, pushing past stunned guests. Security scrambled, but it was too late. I stepped back from the mic, blinking under the flashes, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the brutal clarity of being outplayed. A voice rang out above the chaos. "Daniel." He stepped forward, looking wounded, like a betrayed hero on a stage he'd memorized. "I didn't know," he said, voice cracking perfectly. "I loved her. I trusted her. But I found the messages. She planned everything." He pulled out his phone and projected it onto the ballroom screen. A thread of emails, doctored, false, but convincing, showing me discussing prenups, exit clauses, and legal loopholes. The crowd turned. Murmurs grew sharper. Suspicion blossomed like rot. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, another video began to play. Grace's voice narrated over blurry footage. She tried to bribe me once, paid me to leave her ex-boyfriend, told me he wasn't part of the plan. The footage showed a much younger me, clearly edited, stitched from old video blogs, twisted to fit a damning narrative. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the smear campaign settled around me like wet cement. Someone shouted, "Throw her out!" Another voice, "Is this whole wedding a scam?" I looked to Evelyn, my lawyer, but she was being held back by staff. No one was listening. Security approached. "Miss Carter, you'll need to step outside." I nodded, swallowing the ache. They escorted me through the rear corridor, down a hallway of white roses and gold-framed family portraits. At the far end, just before the service exit, a small hand tugged at mine. I turned. A girl, maybe 16, dressed in catering black, eyes wide with fear. She slipped something into my hand, a USB drive, whispered so only I could hear, "It's everything." Project, inheritance lock. Then she disappeared through the kitchen doors. I stood frozen, my heart still racing from betrayal, my ears still echoing with judgment. But in my palm, I held the first thread that could unravel it all. And for the first time that day, I didn't feel cornered. I felt ready. The night air was sharp against my skin as I stepped out of the service corridor, the USB drive still warm in my palm. The muffled chaos of the reception faded behind the heavy door, replaced by the steady hum of traffic outside the gates. For the first time all day, I was away from the spectacle. I ducked into the waiting car, Evelyn's car. She was already there, laptop open, her hands poised over the keyboard like a pianist before the first note. "Tell me you have something," she said without looking at me. I held up the drive. "I have everything." Within minutes, the screen lit up with data. It wasn't just financial records. It was a complete map of the Reynolds family empire. Shell companies, offshore accounts, transfers to political campaigns under fake names. There was even a ledger for special payments coded in colors I recognized. Gold for hush money, red for sabotage projects. This is enough to sink them," Evelyn murmured, scrolling quickly. "It's enough to make sure they never rise again," I corrected. By 9:45 p.m., Mercedes, I was standing in front of a different audience, not the guests in the grand ballroom, but a wall of cameras, microphones, and flashing lights. I had rented the event hall of a nearby hotel hours earlier, just in case tonight required a different kind of stage. The live stream began. I stood alone at the podium, still in my wedding gown, my veil tossed aside, my voice calm but deliberate. "Tonight was meant to be a celebration of love," I began. Instead, it became a performance, a very expensive one, designed to humiliate me. But the truth about this family goes far deeper than insults. On the screen behind me, documents flashed, bank statements, internal memos, signed authorizations from Victoria herself. For months, funds have been quietly diverted from charitable foundations into private accounts. Political favors have been bought, and the same people who preach about honor and legacy have been using the Reynolds name to hide their crimes. The feed switched to audio clips. Victoria's voice calling me a parasite, Melissa mocking my background, Daniel discussing keeping the optics clean. Back at the mansion, the reception froze as guests pulled out their phones. Daniel sat rigid at the head table, his hand motionless over his untouched drink. Victoria leaned toward him, whispering sharply, but I could see the moment he pulled his hand away from hers. His face had gone pale. Then came the part I'd been saving. I held up a thick document, the embossed seal glinting under the press lights. "And as of last month," I said, "this property." I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. This estate, where my wedding is being held, no longer belongs to the Reynolds family. On the live stream, gasps rippled through the room. At the mansion, Victoria's hand clutched the tablecloth. The guests murmured, heads swiveling, cameras recording her every expression. "I hold the title," I continued, placing the deed on the podium, "and this venue will no longer host liars pretending to be royalty." By midnight, the fallout began. At the mansion, guests were leaving. Not in chaos, but in a quiet, calculated exodus. The business leaders, the investors, they'd seen enough. One by one, I received notifications on my phone, pledges of partnership, offers to invest in my tech companies, statements of withdrawal from Reynolds projects. Social media was ablaze. Your Justice Bride trended within the hour. Clips of my speech circulating faster than the carefully edited videos Grace had planted earlier in the day. My image, standing in a wedding dress at a podium, became a symbol of defiance, the perfect blend of scandal and empowerment. And Grace? She wasn't watching the live stream. She was being led out of her downtown condo in handcuffs. The tax fraud investigation I'd triggered a week ago had been slow-moving, until tonight's publicity gave it the push it needed. Her face, pale and furious, appeared on half the news outlets that had smeared me just hours earlier. I returned to the estate just as the last guests were departing. The ballroom was nearly empty, the air heavy with the faint scent of wilting roses and spilled champagne. Victoria stood at the far end of the room, her composure finally stripped away. Daniel sat slumped at the table, staring at the untouched wedding cake like it was a stranger. I didn't approach either of them. I walked straight to the center of the room, the same spot where she had called me a fraud, and faced the nearest camera. "The wedding is over," I said, my voice steady, "but the fight is just beginning." The click of shutters echoed in the stillness. The following days blurred into a relentless cycle of flashing cameras, headline banners, and phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I had expected scrutiny, but I hadn't anticipated the weight of it, the constant hum of voices parsing every expression I made, dissecting every sentence I'd spoken on that stage. Everywhere I went, they were there. Journalists outside my building, strangers pretending to be neighbors just to get close enough to record me. My own employees dodging questions about my private life. Even the grocery store became a battlefield with tabloid photographers crouched by the parking lot. And then came the dredging. Articles began to surface, not about the Reynolds family, but about me, my college years, my early career, relationships from a decade ago. An old roommate gave an interview claiming I was obsessed with control. A former business partner suggested my sudden success had always seemed too strategic. It was exhausting, not because I had something to hide, but because the noise never stopped. The breaking point came in the form of a message from someone I thought was unshakable, Samantha Price. We'd been friends since the early years of my first startup, through sleepless nights and failed prototypes. She was the one who had convinced me to go to that gala where I met Daniel. Her message was brief. "Emily, I can't be part of this anymore. You've become something I don't recognize. No explanations, no calls, just a blocked notification when I tried to reply. That one hurt more than the public criticism because it was private, it was personal. And it was the first time I questioned whether this entire fight had cost me more than I realized." The night after Samantha's message, I stood alone in my apartment bathroom, the city lights muted by the fogged glass. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror, wearing a stranger's expression. I touched the edge of the sink, trying to anchor myself in something real, but all I saw was a woman who had weaponized her pain until it became unrecognizable. And then, without warning, tears. Not the controlled tears of someone playing a part, but a breaking flood. I gripped the counter, head bowed. "I don't even know who I am anymore," I whispered. The words felt truer than anything I'd said in weeks. The next morning, a new email appeared in my inbox. The sender was anonymous, the subject line, "Inheritance." I hesitated before opening it. Inside was one sentence: "You've surpassed your mother, but I'm still alive." Attached was a PDF, a DNA report. I scrolled through it, heart pounding. The results were unambiguous. I was the biological daughter of Eleanor Reynolds, Daniel's grandmother, the same woman who had been stripped of her inheritance decades ago in a bitter family split. Suddenly, pieces began to shift in my mind like a puzzle I hadn't known I was assembling. My marriage, the hostility, the scrutiny. It wasn't just about Daniel's fortune. It wasn't about Victoria's pride. This was bigger. The Reynolds family hadn't chosen me by accident. I dug deeper, tracing property records, corporate filings, old legal disputes. What I found was staggering. Eleanor had been forced out after her own son, Daniel's father, voted against her in a board decision. In retaliation, she had severed ties completely, disappearing from the public eye. But her assets hadn't vanished. They had been moved, hidden, waiting. And then I saw the last piece, the one that made my blood run cold. A will, a codicil naming the rightful heir born of Eleanor's blood to correct the mistake of history. Me. The entire marriage, every calculated insult, Every test had been part of a decades-long scheme to bring me back into the fold as a tool to restore a legacy I didn't even know I had. I sat back, staring at the documents on my screen. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about Victoria or Daniel or even Grace. I was thinking about Eleanor, and I realized I had never truly been the one moving the pieces on the board. I had been the piece. The room felt smaller suddenly, the city quieter. My wedding, my fight, my so-called victory, it was all just a prelude to someone else's endgame, and the real game was just beginning. The file sat open on my desk, numbers and legal jargon dancing across the screen. Every asset, every stock, every property, tied to the Reynolds legacy, now in my control. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. The DNA report had changed everything. Knowing that I was Eleanor's daughter turned my so-called triumph into something hollow. I hadn't outplayed them. I had simply been a player in a much older game. For 2 nights, I didn't sleep. I walked the length of my apartment, phone buzzing with calls from lawyers, journalists, and investors. Every voice wanted something, my endorsement, my cooperation, my silence. By the 3rd morning, I knew what I had to do. I called Evelyn. "Draft the transfers," I said. "To whom?" she asked, startled. "To a foundation," I replied. One dedicated to funding education for girls who've been lied to, underestimated, used as bargaining chips. I want it airtight. No Reynolds name, no Emily Carter name. Anonymous. There was a pause. "You're walking away." "I'm not walking away," I said quietly, "and I'm breaking the game." The announcement came a week later. I held no press conference, gave no interviews. A simple statement was released to every outlet. All assets inherited from the Reynolds estate have been transferred to an independent trust dedicated to women's education. Emily Carter will hold no personal claim to these funds, effective immediately. The media went into a frenzy dissecting my motives. Some called it strategic rebranding. Others claimed it was guilt. I didn't care. I packed my apartment into a few boxes, selling most of my belongings. The city felt different now. Its noise no longer a challenge to overcome, but a hum I was finally ready to leave behind. Before I left, I recorded one final message. Not for the press, not for the Reynolds, but for the people who had followed my story. "The truth doesn't need to shout," I said, looking directly into the camera. "It only needs the right moment." I closed the laptop, powered it down, and slipped it into storage. By the end of that week, I was gone. New York became another closed chapter in a book I had no intention of reopening. 3 years later, the world had moved on. The Reynolds family had fractured under the weight of their own scandals. Victoria's influence had faded. Daniel had retreated from public life. Grace was still serving her sentence. The foundation, anonymous as intended, was thriving. Dozens of scholarships had been awarded. Entire programs were launched in cities I'd never even visited. In a coastal town far from Manhattan, I rented a small house with a garden. No reporters came here. No one asked about Eleanor. I spent my mornings writing, my afternoons walking along the shore. I didn't miss the noise. Then, one summer afternoon, a cream-colored envelope arrived. It was from a group of young women, founders of a startup incubator for female entrepreneurs. Inside was a simple invitation. "To the anonymous founder, your words changed our path. We are launching the next generation of innovators, and we'd be honored if you attended." I stared at it for a long time. It was the first time in years I had felt a pull toward the world I'd left. The event was held in a renovated warehouse, sunlight spilling through high windows onto rows of folding chairs. The room buzzed with energy, young women in sharp blazers, laptops open, voices brimming with ideas. I slipped into a seat at the very back. No one recognized me. My hair was shorter now, my clothes simple. I was just another face in the crowd. On stage, one of the founders took the mic. She spoke about resilience, about turning betrayal into strength. And then she quoted a line that made the room fall silent. "Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals." The audience erupted in applause. She smiled. Those words came from someone who inspired us all, though she remains unnamed. But her legacy is here, in this room, in every project you will launch. I felt something shift in my chest. Not pride, not vindication. Just a quiet certainty that the fight I'd endured had grown into something far larger than me. When the speeches ended, people mingled, exchanging cards, ideas, dreams. I stood, moving quietly toward the exit. No one stopped me. No one knew. At the door, I glanced back once. The room was alive with the kind of energy I used to chase. It didn't belong to me anymore, and that was exactly as it should be. I stepped outside, the sunlight warm against my face. The sound of the ocean was faint in the distance. And then I walked away, disappearing into the city, leaving the world to wonder where Emily Carter had gone.